So tell me again, what is tracking?
Tracking is checking on how you're doing to see if what you're doing is effective and to see where you are in relation to your end goal.
Perfect. So there, in what you said is perfect example. There's this idea of progress, and there's this idea of, am I finished? So that's kind of the path we're taking. So why do we track? If tracking is important, why do we track?
So we don't walk in circles.
Yes. If you don't track, you will end up walking in circles. So we've talked about target, which is really our vision. Our target and our vision gives us what? It gives us the general direction we're going. But then tracking lets us measure our progress and allows us for course correction. So if you have no vision and you don't have tracking, like Josh said, you just walk in circles. And this has been proven over and over again sociologically. If you take someone and you put blindfolds on their eyes and you just drop them out somewhere in a desert or an open area, and they put a GPS responder on them and they walk, and they tell the people, don't walk in circles, walk in a straight line east. But as they track them, guess what they inevitably always do? They just walk in circles because they have no point of reference. So vision or target and tracking gives you, one, the direction you're supposed to go, but then it gives you a metric of, are we actually going in that direction? So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Tom to put us into 2 different breakout rooms. And then in each room, you're going to have 5 passages of scripture. Because what I don't want to convince you of is tracking is a good idea apart from scripture. Ultimately, we should be asking as we inform our strategy, does scripture teach us tracking? Do we see that in the ministry of Jesus? Do we see that in the ministry of the apostles? Do we see that as wisdom in the Old Testament as an example? So we're going to break into 2 rooms, room 1, room 2, and then there's 5 passages for each group. We're going to give you 10 minutes, so 2 minutes per passage. So you're not going to spend a ton of time. But what I want you to do is look at these passages and tell me, okay, 1, is tracking a biblical idea? And then I want you to, when you come back, you're going to give a little bit of report. Tell us what the context is on these verses. Okay. Now let's debrief these. And so we'll start with Josiah's group 1. And if you could just give maybe a 1 or 2 sentence summary of specifically answering the question, which each passage informs us of why we should track. What is it telling us as maybe an idea, or you can just give some context of the passage. What we're really trying to say is the scripture really teach us to track and why. So I don't know if you each individually took a passage, maybe you can just one person as a spokesperson or the person who read or primarily contributed for each passage.
Sounds good. Should we just lay so we'll go down and just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the person that did it in each of it to kind of share?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so Josh and Kyla were first.
In Acts 21, Paul recounts one by one all things that God had done through him among the Gentiles, so he was keeping track.
We see a similar pattern throughout several other passages in the book of Acts, where Paul and Barnabas, they are giving testimony time and recounting about all God's done among the Gentiles to others. And at least once it also says one by one.
What was the outcome of Paul sharing that information? What were people doing because of it?
Which time?
Glorifying God, praised God for what he had done.
Yeah, perfect. So oftentimes we don't think of tying tracking and metrics to glorifying God, but Paul was giving a report, and it compelled them to glorify God.
I read Acts chapter 21, verses 19 and 20, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. It says about how the gospel was preached and how many people believed and how they turned to the Lord. That was the central idea in the 2 passages. it shows how tracking is so important here.
Yeah, perfect. It was showing what God was doing through his people.
Yeah. I had Matthew, I like basically the parable of the talents, and the two servants that had taken their talents and made more of them. Both were able to give like the number. They're like, I made so and so many talents.
I had passages in Genesis, Matthew, and Revelation. It was talking about how God promised to multiply Abraham's descendants, and then how Jesus had the Great Commission of asking people to go and that there would be disciples from all nations. And then in Revelation, it was talking about an uncountable number of people from all nations and tribes and tongues worshiping Jesus. So it was, I guess we're in the middle of that, but eventually there'll be an uncountable number of people who are praising God.
And that was all of you guys, right?
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. So the group I was in, you guys want to pick up where they left off?
Yeah, so I started off with Colossians chapter 1, 3 through 14, and Paul is kind of commending the Colossians for how there's just been a lot of people who are reporting that the gospel is being proclaimed by them. And he kind of exhorts them there, and he gives a lot of thanks throughout the passage, giving thanks to God for the proclamation of the gospel that is happening from their church. And then another similar passage in 2 Corinthians where Paul is kind of recounting his afflictions and persecution that he's been going through, and he requests that the Corinthian church pray for him in order that people will also be able to give thanks on behalf of Paul and his work. So yes, I think kind of just this idea that that they are, in both scenarios, they're thankful because of the like fruitfulness of the gospel that is happening in both situations.
Yeah, I think this is a really good one that we overlook sometimes, that it was both of those instances included prayer. So like tracking informs prayer. So even if you send out a ministry update, you're kind of giving some tracking that's in informing people's prayers.
We had Proverbs 27, 23 through 27, and the verse that stuck out to us most was verse 23, which said, "Be sure you know the condition of your flocks," which pretty much tells us straight out, pay attention to your flock, make sure that you're keeping track of them, and then it goes on to talk about how you never know what's going to happen, and so you need to be aware of numbers and supplies and things like that.
We had a couple passages in Acts and Titus. In Acts, it was about Barnabas going to Antioch to assess the situation after some Hellenists believe. And so the first time it left the Jewish audience. And then later on in Acts and Titus about appointing elders. And so just tracking helps us know where our leaders needed, where our workers needed, where are there new believers that maybe need to be discipled. This helps us, direct workers.
I had the Ephesians passage, which encourages us to make the best use of our time. And as it relates to tracking, this just helps us use tracking to essentially make strategic decisions.
Yeah, and I had Romans 15, 14 through 24. And that's where Paul says that he has no more room for work in these regions. And so tracking can help us cast vision for God's work and to point people to where the gospel has not went. Because also in this section, he talks about not wanting to build on someone else's foundation. He wants to proclaim the gospel where it's not yet been proclaimed. So tracking helps us know where the gaps are and where to mobilize people toward. Great job. So if I could get one person to summarize just one primary takeaway that you would use to try to convince someone, maybe a partner who has had a difficult situation with tracking, maybe they've had tracking that wasn't helpful. How would you communicate with someone to help them understand the value of tracking? Just one person, what was your primary takeaway?